Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we delve further into the wisdom of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply appreciate your support. Please take a moment to like and share this audiobook, helping us expand its reach and granting more individuals access to its profound insights. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for instant notifications when new content is released. Together, we can disseminate the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community dedicated to enlightenment and inner peace. Your participation in our mission to make these transformative teachings universally accessible is truly invaluable. Let's begin today's reading. A Noble Warrior's Path. March 26, 2014. The Buddha was a member of the noble warrior caste. In fact, it's said that of the past 7 Buddhas, only one was not a member of the warrior caste, and a warrior sensibility permeates his teachings. You see this with the imagery he uses, comparing a meditator to a skilled archer, to a soldier facing an approaching army, even to elephants and horses trained in battle. And this sensibility is not just in the imagery. It's in the content as well. The Noble Eightfold Path bears a lot of similarities to the education of a soldier. You learn the right view on how to GHT. You learn the right motivation, the resolve to come out victorious, and to do whatever is needed to achieve that end. You have a code of honor on what constitutes right speech, right action, and right livelihood. Right mindfulness keeps in mind what you've learned. Keeps in mind how to analyze things so that you know which tactics to apply when you end yourself face to face with the enemy. Mindfulness helps you keep your wits about you, and right concentration keeps you steady and strong in the face of whatever comes up. You don't lose your head. The most important similarity, of course, is that the Buddha's teachings are strategic, just like a soldier's or a warrior's. There's a story in Thai history that the Thais love to tell. Thailand had been conquered by the Burmese, and 2 princes of the Thai royal house were captured and taken to Burma, the idea being that Thailand was going to be a vassal state, so the princes needed to be trained to be good vassals to the Burmese king. While they were living in the palace of the Burmese king, they developed a rivalry with the king's son, the Burmese viceroy. The rivalry came to a head when all 3 of them were sent out to deal with a bandit with large forces who had holed up in a mountain fortress, plundering the countryside. The viceroy was placed in charge of the RST attack against the bandit. His tactic was just to lead a large army up the road on the front of the mountain, but the bandit chief drove the viceroy and his forces back down. Again. Then it was the turn of the Thai princes. Their strategy was to send a small army up the road on the front of the mountain, which drew the armies of the bandit chief down the road. Meanwhile, the princes had led a larger army up the back of the mountain. They seized the bandit fortress and then the bandit chief along with all his forces. It's because they thought strategically that they won. And as we're practicing here, we have to think strategically, too. There's a passage where Ananda talks about 3 things that the practice is aimed at abandoning. Actually, we'll be giving up our need for these things as a result of the practice, but we need to use them in the meantime. And they parallel the things that you have to provide for soldiers. There's food, there's desire, and there's condense. As for food, as Napoleon said, an army has to march on its stomach. But our food here is right concentration, using it to gain a sense of well-being to sustain us along the way. What do you get the sense of well-being from? From the V aggregates. We know that eventually we're going to have to give them up, but RST we need to get some use out of them. After all, they do have their uses, they owe their pleasures for all that they're stressful, so why throw them away? Even though our aim is the deathless, you have to realize that you can't use the deathless as a path. You can't use it for anything at all. It's outside of conditioned experience, so it's not a means to anything. That means you have to use the means, the conditioned things you've got. So you focus on the form of the body, you focus on the breath, as you feel it. Breathe in a way that gives rise to feelings of well-being and ease. Hold the perception of the breath in mind and try to adjust the perception so that it allows you to breathe in a way that's really comfortable. You have to question your perceptions if your breathing feels cramped or tight. Maybe you're perceiving the breath in the wrong way. What other ways can you picture it to yourself? Experiment. And as you're thinking about your breath and evaluating it, that's the aggregate of fabrication. Meanwhile, your consciousness is aware of all of these things. So you've got the V aggregates right here in right concentration, which is your nourishment on the path. Without the well-being and nourishment that come from right concentration, the path gets dry pretty fast. And as for perceptions of the three characteristics, don't apply them too quickly to what you're doing. There's a passage in the commentaries describing the three characteristics as the Buddha's categorical teaching, in other words, the teaching that's true across the board. But the Buddha didn't treat them that way. There are only two teachings in the whole canon that he treats as categorical. One is the Four Noble Truths, and the other is the principle that skillful qualities should be developed and unskillful ones should be abandoned. Those two teachings are true across the board. As the Buddha showed, the three characteristics, or rather, the three perceptions, should be applied only in certain times in certain places. There was once a young monk who was asked by a wanderer from another sect what the results of karma were, and the monk said, stress. Then the monk went back to the Buddha and asked him if he'd given the right answer, and the Buddha said, no. When asked about karma, you talk about how skillful karma leads to pleasure, how unskillful karma leads to pain. Another one of the other monks piped up and said, well, wasn't he thinking about the fact that all feelings are stressful? And the Buddha replied, essentially, that was not the time or place for that teaching. So, an important part of strategy is knowing which teachings to use when and not jumping the gun or trying to skip over things. When you're practicing concentration, apply the three perceptions or any other type of contemplation that would give rise to dispassion to the things that would pull you out of concentration. But while you're trying to develop the concentration, you don't focus on the fact that the concentration is inconstant, because in the very beginning, it's all too obviously inconstant. You want to focus on making it as constant and pleasant and under your control as possible. For the time being, you have to push against the three characteristics. Otherwise, you won't have the strength you need to stick with the path. This is where Ven Ananda's other two factors come in. Soldiers need motivation in order to GHT. And the motivation comes down to two things. One is the desire to win, and the other is the confidence that you can. The desire that Ananda talked about here comes from hearing that other people have achieved awakening, so you want that, too. Of course, the desire has to be focused properly, not just on the goal but primarily on the means to the goal. So you focus right here. Each breath coming in, each breath going out. Each breath is the next step on your path. It's through developing the path that the goal is found. The path and the goal are not the same thing. But it's by focusing totally on the path right here that the goal will appear right here. So there's an intimate connection between the two. And your desire to take this path to the goal is what keeps you going. As for the confidence, it's a quality that in Pali is called conceit, mana. Here Ananda isn't telling you to be conceited. Instead, he's telling you to have the confidence that if other people can do this, they're human beings, I'm a human being, they can do it, why can't I? This is what gives you the confidence to keep on going, even when the going is tough. Ultimately, we want to get rid of desire and conceit, but we have to use them on the path. If you don't have desire to get to the end of the path, you're just going to lie down on the path. And we know what happens when people lie down on paths. They get trampled or run over. If you don't have the confidence, you give up even before you've tried. So as a soldier, you need your food. You need your desire, you need your confidence, your conceit. You use these things strategically. That conceit here is a healthy sense of self, you want to develop that. The desire is part of right eart. And the food is right concentration. So all these elements of the path are strategic. You learn to use them when they're appropriate and to put them aside when they're not. When the job is done, you put everything aside. But until you're done, there are things you've got to develop, things you've got to work at. And there are times when it's going to get discouraging. That's when you have to learn how to give yourself good pep talks to strengthen that sense of confidence, strengthen the sense of desire. When you're feeling weak, look for where you can ND food. If you can't get the food of right concentration, learn to develop the food of generosity, the food of virtue. All these things are nourishing to the heart. Reaction on your generosity and reaction on your virtue help to give rise to that sense of confidence and to the sense of honor that we're doing something really noble here. And it's important to remember that the noble warriors were not just men, there were female noble warriors as well. If you were a female member of the noble warrior caste, you had to learn a lot of these attitudes. 2. You knew the men in the family were going into danger, so you had to learn skills to support them. The female noble warriors were the surgeons. Their husbands, their brothers, and sons would come home with arrows in them, and it was the duty of the women to get the arrows out. So they had to have a brave and unflinching spirit, too. So it's good to remember that the Buddha's knowledge is warrior knowledge, i.e., knowledge of skills to be used in difficult situations, so that you can come out victorious. Back in the old days, they made a distinction between warrior knowledge and scribe knowledge. Scribe knowledge was just the knowledge of words and definitions. As for warrior knowledge, it needs to use words too, but it's more concerned with their strategic uses. To train you in skills. To develop your ingenuity, to re-up your ting spirit, to give you maxims to keep in mind when the going gets tough, so that you can approach difficult situations with skill. To keep those words in mind, those instructions in mind, without losing your presence of mind in difficult situations. That's the function of right mindfulness. But in particular, the qualities of right view, right resolve, right ear, and right concentration are your warrior strategies. And it's worth your while to develop them as skills. Comparing mind. September 29, 2015. A couple of years back, I came across a photography book in which the photographer presented pictures of many scenes, with 2 different pictures of each scene. The larger was the one that he preferred. The second one was paired with it to give a sense of what was better about the larger one. Seeing the 2 photographs right next to each other was very educational, because you could see that, yes, the larger one was better not because it was larger, but for a lot of other reasons. The composition, the color palette, the point of view. It was a good book for training your eye, whether you're planning to become a photographer yourself, or just wanting to learn how to appreciate photography. It's good to have your eye trained that way, having something to compare so that you can see, yes, this is different from that, this is better than that. And you begin to understand why. It's the same with meditation. We're here comparing mind states. We're trying to get the mind into a better state than it normally would be in if it were just left to its own devices. And to get a sense of what's more skillful and what's less skillful, it's good to have comparisons. This is one of the reasons why you have to meditate so much. So that you can begin to have a range of comparisons as to what kind of concentration is skillful concentration, what kind of concentration is a little foggy, when you're putting too much pressure on it, when you're not putting enough. You need things to compare. And this is a skillful use of the comparing mind. The Buddha calls this analysis of qualities. It's one of the factors for awakening. He denotes it very simply as making the distinction between what's skillful and what's not. And, of course, skillful has many levels. Luang Pu Dun made a similar comment one time, saying that, with regard to developing insight, once the mind gets still, you start comparing things. He said, things that are dark, things that are bright, meaning, of course, dark and bright states of mind. You compare the results of what you're doing so that you can gain a sense of what's skillful, what's not. Then you have to connect the results to what you're doing so that you can gain a sense of how to change what you're doing, if it's not coming out the way you want it, or if there are better ways of doing it. This willingness to ask these questions is what keeps your meditation alive. Otherwise, you start drifting getting kind of drowsy, trying to force the mind to stay with one thing, And as it stays with one thing, it begins to get dull because the mind is used to jumping around. Liking this, liking that, then deciding it doesn't like this, running over there to something else. And it gets entertained as it jumps around. But here we're asking you to stay still. Still but alert. And one of the best ways of staying alert is to ask questions. Start with simple things like, what kind of breath does the body need now? And breathe that way for a while. Then change it, breathe in another way, and then compare. If you're not sure about the results of your comparison, well, try something else. Breathe in a different way, and then a different way, until you now gain a sense that the breath has this kind of influence on the mind, this kind of influence on the body. That way, you can start learning how to read what the body and the mind need. It's not the case that there's one ideal breath for concentration. Sometimes, when the body is tired, it needs an energizing breath. When it's tense, it needs one that's more relaxing. When you're carrying some issues in from the day, sometimes you have to do some work some active contemplation, to get the mind ready to stay with the breath. That's something you've got to learn how to read too. So to read, you have to compare. All too often we hear that you shouldn't make use of the comparing mind in your meditation. If you're just on meditation retreat for a weekend or so, that might be good advice. Otherwise, if you're trying to force the results of your short time on retreat, you get all tied up in knots. But when you think of meditation as a lifelong activity, which it is, you're working on developing the mind. You're aiming at results. And the mind is always going to need developing in one direction or another until you reach full awakening. There's always more work to be done. And the more work you do, the more good work you do, the more you bean tea. So if you think of this as a lifelong activity, you've got to learn how to compare. Otherwise, the meditation doesn't become a skill. It's just a random shot in the dark. You shoot up in the air, and maybe once in a while you hit something, but there's no skill, there's no system to it, there's no science to it. It's all very random. You don't want your meditation to be random. Certain causes lead to certain results, and a large part of discernment lies in seeing the connection between causes and results and having a sense of which ones are better. As you learn to ask yourself these questions, it gets you out of the dullness of a concentration that's just sitting there getting drowsier and duller and drowsier and duller. You have to take an interest in what's going on in your mind. Part of this, of course, requires learning how to figure out when's a good time to ask questions and when to just stick with one object without too much thinking. That's something you've got to learn how to read too. If you ask too many questions, you get pulled away. There's a right time for questions, and there are right and wrong questions. And a number one question to avoid is my meditation better than somebody else's? Or is it worse than somebody else's? Or am I a better person than somebody else? That kind of comparing mind is to be put aside. If you want to learn from other people, then it's okay to ask if someone else is doing something better than you are, for the purpose of trying to adopt their skill and make it your own. But if you simply want to compare just for the sake of comparison, remember how arbitrary that kind of measurement can be. Better can be measured in many different ways. Sometimes we get good at a particular skill, and other people are not quite as good in the technical side of the skill, and there's some pride that comes around that. But then other people may be bringing a better attitude to their skill, in which case, you're worse than they are. So if you end yourself comparing yourself with other people, try to focus in on the actions that you can learn from. And even then you have to learn how to look all around. Ajahn Mahabua talks about the pride he developed over the fact that he was able to observe the Dhutanga practices better than any of the other monks staying with Ajahn Mun. But Ajahn Mun would every now and then do a little something to get in the way of Ajahn Mahabua's Dhutanga practice, just to show him that it's not all about the ability to stick to the rules. There's a quality of the heart, a quality of the attitude, the pride, that you've got to watch out for, too. Being really good is something that's all around. And because we tend to side with ourselves, we have to be very careful about this. How we measure what's skillful and what's not. We have to learn how to use our comparing mind skillfully if we're going to get some bean tea out of it. Again, this is one of the reasons why people have warned about comparing mind. But just telling yourself, well, don't compare doesn't allow you to learn anything. You have to learn how to compare different ways of comparing to see which ones are more useful, more skillful, which ones get more well-rounded results. So look at your actions and see if you can look at them again, from many different angles, to see what's lacking. Sometimes, say, with the meditation, you may be doing the technique okay, but something else is lacking. Either the ability to ask the right questions or just having a sense of what's better than what. What kind of mind state is really useful for the practice? What kind of mind states actually get in the way? Even though they may seem nice on the surface, you've got to live with these things for a while to really read them. So the ability to develop a skill, to develop some maturity in your comparing mind. That's what helps develop the meditation as a genuine skill, an all-around skill, something that changes not only the state of your mind, but also changes the state of your heart. Because, after all, we're training the whole heart and the whole mind, not just part of it. This means that your powers of judgment should learn how to be all around, looking at things from many angles. That way, the meditation becomes more than just a skill. It can lead to a real revolution inside. 201. Intelligent about change. July 22, 2016. Not all change is good, not all change is bad, and not all change is important. There are basically two kinds of change that are important. One is the fact that we tend to look for happiness in things that are going to change, hoping that they'll last, hoping that they'll be reliable. And again, we're disappointed, like the person who kept eating hot peppers, hoping to end a sweet one someday. That kind of change is the change you have to accept, so that you can go beyond it. But it's important to understand what acceptance means here. You don't just accept the fact that things change and leave it at that. You set your sights higher, looking for a happiness that doesn't change. The other kind of change that's really important is the fact that your mind is so changeable. As the Buddha once said, it's so quick to change that even he couldn't think of a good analogy for how quick it was. Here he was, the master of analogies, and even he couldn't end an analogy for how quickly the mind can change. The twinkling of an eye is still slower than the mind when it's ready to change. And that's the kind of change you have to GHT. Once the mind is in good shape, you have to resist its tendency to change. To deal with the RST type of change, you have to develop discernment. To deal with the second type, you have to develop mindfulness. You hear again and again the Ajahns in Thailand talking about how the essential factors of the path are mindfulness and discernment. The two words sati and panna go together in Thai. In fact, in Thai, when you put the two together as a compound sati panna, mindfulness and discernment, it means intelligence. And that's what intelligence is. It's not a matter of trying to see that all change is good or all change is bad, or that all change is something to be accepted. Instead, you're discerning, and you figure out how to deal properly with whatever change comes your way. With regard to the things that the mind tries to end happiness in, that's when you have to develop discernment around the three perceptions to see where these things are inconstant, and the fact that they're inconstant means that they're stressful. You can't really end a lasting happiness there. And if something is inconstant and stressful, is it worth calling yourself? Is it worth identifying with? Is it worth pursuing as your basis for happiness? These perceptions are tools for peeling away your attachments to things that change in that way. But what are you going to do as you keep pulling away your attachments? Where are you left? That's where mindfulness comes in. As the Buddha says, the duty of mindfulness is not just to watch things arise and pass away. Its actual duty is to actively give rise to things that are skillful, and to help unskillful things pass away more quickly. This is what you've got to remember. Right mindfulness deals with the things you need to keep in mind as you try to develop skillful qualities and abandon unskillful ones. If something skillful comes up in the mind, you don't just simply watch it come and go and say, well, that's change. you remember to do your best to make it arise. When it's there, you remember to do your best to keep it coming, to keep it in place, and to let it grow. As for unskillful things, you remember to do your best to get rid of them. Once you're rid of them, you remember to make sure they don't come back. It's by overcoming this second kind of change, the changeability of the mind, that you actually give yourself the strength you need in order to deal with the RST kind of change, analyzing it with your discernment. To do this, you've got to develop all the strengths of the mind. There are basically V, and all V are things you want to work at bringing into being so that when you feel weak, you have something to fall back on. When the mind feels very susceptible to change, wanting to give up in its pursuit of what's really good for it, and to accept a less than ideal happiness, you want to be able to remind yourself that you've got strengths to sustain you through the tough patches along the path. At the very least, you've got conviction that the Buddha was right. That human beings can do this, can put an end to sewering, and that it's a really worthwhile project. Even if the project goes more slowly than you would hope, you can't say, well, I'll just give up on this for the time being and pursue something else, because this thought will then be constantly nagging away at the back of the mind, trying to pull you over the path. You've got to have conviction that the Buddha could do it. He was a human being, he could do it. You're a human being, you can do it, too. That's the attitude he has you take. Even though that's a form of conceit, it's useful conceit. What you're doing here, as you're developing these strengths, is that you're taking things that are impermanent, but you're turning them into the path. In Ven Ananda's image, when he was once talking to the Buddha, he praised the Buddha for teaching how to go across a river by going from one dependence to another. In other words, you can't just Y across the river. You've got to step here, step there, on a rock here, a rock there. The rocks may be a little bit wobbly and unstable, but they're stable enough for you to walk across the river on. That's what you've got to depend on to get to RM ground. From that conviction comes persistence. You stick with the path and you use whatever tool comes to hand. A true warrior is not very picky about his weapons. He tries to have the best weapons possible, of course, but when they're not at hand, he has to use what is at hand. That's when unexpected things can show their power. There was a movie years back called Willow. It was a big op here in the States but a wild success in Asia. It told the story of a cheap village magician who had one little trick, and it was a pretty cheap trick. That's how he made his living. It was good enough to wow his fellow peasants. But then he gets swept up in a big battle between sorcerers and sorceresses, and at the very end, he's facing Oa against the ultimate enemy. And it turns out that that cheap little trick he played to fool the other peasants actually works against the super sorcerer. So you have to remember, whatever trick works in keeping the mind here in the present moment, keeping it from slipping into unskillful qualities. Whether it's a sophisticated trick or an unsophisticated trick, you don't have to worry. If it works, and sometimes when your dilemmas get really sophisticated, a blunt instrument or a cheap trick is what you need to deal with them. So you stick with it. You keep at the practice regardless. And having the kind of momentum that whatever comes up, I'm going to deal with it the best I can. It may be kind of scrappy and you may not succeed every time, but at least having that attitude that if it's unskillful, GHT it, if it's skillful, encourage it. This is what you've got to keep in mind. This is where mindfulness becomes a strength. You remember what you need to do and how to get past the tricks of the dilemmas, and you see the results that come from actually doing what you remember you should do. Seeing those results encourages you to make your mindfulness even stronger. For example, an unskillful voice in the mind may say, well, you're going to give in anyhow, so why don't you give in now and make it easy for all of us? You've got to remember that you've fallen for that voice many, many times before, and what you're responsible for right now is right now. As for what you're going to do V minutes down the line, you say, we'll deal with that V minutes down the line, but right now we're ting. And if you keep on having that attitude right now, it gets you well past the V minutes. Gradually, As your mindfulness gets stronger and more consistent, you develop the strength of concentration. We were talking today about the strength of the breath. Well, what makes the breath strong is your focus. The focus strengthens the breath, and then as the breath gets more consistently comfortable, that it gets easier to stay focused. The two qualities help each other along, strength of focus and strength of body, but the preliminary strength comes from your concentration. So remember that strength of mind is what matters most, much more than the strength of the body. Because, after all, the body's going to leave us. It's something we think we can depend on infinitely, no matter how much we know that we're going to die. We have this attitude that this body's going to be different, but it's not. And it can surprise you how it comes up with diseases you wouldn't have thought possible. When it does, you need strength of mind, the attitude that regardless of what the body does, you're not going to be fazed. You're going to keep doing your best. Years back there was a woman suffering from cancer who went to stay with Ajahn Mahabua for a couple of months, together with her friend who was an old retired doctor. Ajahn Mahabua gave a long series of Dhamma talks for her being tea every evening. Finally the woman went back home and ultimately died. Her friend the doctor was still around. And she got the tapes that the woman had made of all the talks. So the old doctor, even though her eyesight was going, tried to see, can I transcribe all the tapes? And she did. She said that she took encouragement from Ajahn Mahabua's comment that, as your body gets older, you want to see how much good you can still squeeze out of it. She was past 80, but she was still able to transcribe 2 enormous Dhamma books. So even though the process was slower than getting a professional or someone who was younger to do it, still it meant a lot to her that she could manage it herself. We should all have that attitude. Squeeze what you can out of what you've got. As you keep working with your tools as they are, you really do get into good concentration. Again, whether it happens quickly or slowly, and whether it's how you imagined it might be or not, none of those things matter. What matters is that you ultimately get there. Of course, in doing this, you develop the strength of discernment as you learn the tricks of the trade. How to get the mind to settle down, how to get the mind to stay there, and how to keep your guard up for whatever is going to come along and destroy your concentration. And ultimately you even begin to see what in the concentration is still an unnecessary burden, and you can let that go, too. This is a lot of the strength of discernment. It's a strength that comes when you see you carry around too many loads, and you begin to realize, oh, this is a load I can let go of, this is another load I can let go of. That's one of the signs of wisdom. Your ability to see which things really are your responsibility and which things are not. And as you lighten your load, then even though the strength of the body may be declining, still the fact that the load on the mind is lighter means that your mind can manage it. These issues all fall under that second kind of change. The change you want to remember to stop, to prevent good but changeable things in the mind from slipping away. You do this by ting whatever is going to come and try to destroy them. Remembering this is the duty of mindfulness, but it pulls in discernment, it pulls in all your other good qualities as well. So as you look at change in yourself and change around you, remember that certain changes are a lot more important than others, and they have to take priority. First, the changes where you have to use your discernment to accept the fact that they will change, and to learn to release yourself from any attachment to them. And then, second, the changes where you GHT the change, so as to maintain the good qualities of the mind. Mindfulness can slip away so easily, concentration can slip away so easily, but you're going to be mindful to GHT against that happening. You try to develop and maintain these things because, after all, that's one of the duties of the Four Noble Truths. To develop and maintain the factors of the path. All too often, people talk about the 3 characteristics or the 3 perceptions totally without reference to the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths carry 4 different duties, and one of those duties is to develop concentration, to develop mindfulness. You don't just watch these things come and go. Then, within the context of the Four Noble Truths, you use the 3 perceptions to help with the duties of each truth. to comprehend stress, to abandon the cause, to realize cessation, and to develop the path. So make sure you keep your duties straight and use some intelligence around change. Use your discernment, use your mindfulness, so that you can gain the good that comes from managing change in the proper way. Finally, of course, by doing this you get to something that doesn't change. Those good qualities enable the mind to open up to another dimension that's totally free from change. That's why we work on them. Ultimately, they will fall away. After all, they're part of the path, and the path is fabricated. But the goal isn't fabricated. Once attained, it doesn't fall away. The path doesn't cause the goal. It takes you there. And the goal is something else entirely. So even when the factors of the path fall away, the goal remains. It's like climbing a ladder up to a house. Once you're in the house, it doesn't matter if the ladder falls away, because you have no more need for it. The house is so good that you never have to leave, or even want to leave. It's that good. This means that we focus on change, learning to be intelligent about change, so that we can end a basis for happiness that really is worthwhile, one that's not going to change on us at all. Once you've found that, you can let everything else go, because what you've found doesn't need any support or any improvement at all. It's the ultimate happiness, and it won't let you down. Right View about Right View. February 26, 2016. There are only two principles that the Buddha said are categorical, in other words, true across the board in all situations. One is the principle that skillful thoughts, words, and deeds should be developed, and unskillful ones should be abandoned. The other principle is the Four Noble Truths. Now, you notice that the three characteristics are not on that list. In fact, the word three characteristics is never applied by the Buddha to the teachings on inconstancy, stress, and not self. He calls them perceptions. In a couple of cases, they're also called contemplations, which means that they're ways of looking at things. When you try to map these perceptions or contemplations onto the Four Noble Truths, it's best to think of them as tools for furthering the duties appropriate to the truths. To develop dispassion for suffering, to abandon its cause, to realize its cessation, and to develop the path. In other words, they're meant to serve a purpose. And because they don't qualify as categorical, that means that they're useful only for certain times and situations. It's important to keep that point in mind. The Forest Ajahns bring this point out in their teachings. In some passages they describe how things are not only inconstant, but also constant, not only stressful, but also pleasant, not only not self, but self. Think about the challenge that Ajahn Mahabua made one time. He said, try to prove the Buddha wrong. In this case, this means trying to see if there are any things that are constant. And in certain ways, there are. As Ajahn Lee points out, your lower lip has never turned into your upper lip. Your arm has never turned into your leg. The elements always stay the same. Solidity has always been solidity and hasn't turned into anything else. So there is that constant aspect to things. Or, as Ajahn Chah points out, the way in which things change is pretty constant. So you could latch on to the fact that things are constant. You could latch on to the way in which they're inconstant. The question is, what happens when you don't latch on, and instead simply use these perceptions when they're appropriate? Similarly with pleasure and pain. The Buddha himself points out that the V-aggregates are not only painful, not totally stressful. They also have their pleasant side. If they didn't offer any pleasure, no one would be attached to them. At the same time, there are also plenty of passages in the canon that talk about the need to develop a skillful sense of self. And there are passages talking about not self. Ajahn Lee, too, talks about seeing the side of things that is inconstant, stressful and not self, and the side that's constant, easeful and under your control. But the point is you have to learn to let go of both sides if you want to get to something unfabricated. Someone once asked Ajahn Mahabua whether Nibbana is self or not self, and he replied that Nibbana is Nibbana. In other words, you have to contemplate self and not self in order to get there, but once you've gotten there, it's something different entirely. All this relates to two main points that are important in the practice. One is that when the Ajahns talk about conventional truths, they don't contrast them with ultimate truths. In other words, they don't maintain, for example, that to say that there's such a person as Lionel or Isabella or then Isaac, or whoever, is just a conventional truth, whereas saying that they're aggregates is an ultimate truth. Instead, the Ajahns contrast conventional truths with release, which means that even talking about everybody here in terms of aggregates would still be a convention. So these are conventions. They're to be used. When properly used, they lead to something that's not words, but we need to use the words to get there. We need to use the truths. That's one important point. That we're not here to arrive at right view, we're here to use right view to go beyond. This means that you need to have right view about right view, in other words, realizing that that's not the goal. It's part of the path. The other point relates to what are called vipasanapakalisa, the corruptions of insight. These can happen very easily when you're meditating, and especially when you're all alone. You come across some sort of experience that really impresses you with its truth or its power, and you latch onto it, saying, "This must be true. This must be right." Well, we're not here to get to truthness or rightness. We use truths and we use rightness to go beyond them. But if you just latch onto them, you've misused them right there. So one of the reasons that the Ajahns talk about going beyond right and wrong and true and false is because when you latch onto true and false, it can really cause you a lot of trouble. It can get in the way of any further progress in the path, especially if you believe you've arrived at some noble attainment, simply because you've seen the truth of some teaching related to the three perceptions, such as seeing that there is no self. So remember, these truths are here to be used. They're here to perform. They perform a duty and then you put them aside. Like woodworking tools. You use them when you build a chair or a desk, but when you're nished, you put them aside. In this way, you have right view about right view. You use the rightness of the path, and it is a right path because it works. But it is a path. We're working on developing dispassion, but we need to have some passion for the path to develop it. We use it to develop dispassion for everything over the path, and only then do we develop dispassion for it, too. So when you discover a truth, ask yourself, what's the use of this truth now? In what way is it useful for the things I have to develop dispassion for? In which ways is it useless? In which ways is it going to have a bad effect on my mind? That's what you always want to look at. What is the effect that this has on the mind? If you see that it gives rise to passion, well, you treat it the same way you treat any pleasure or pain. How does it relate to the duties of the path that I have to do now? Certain pleasures, the Buddha said, are totally harmless, but other pleasures can be bad for you, so you've got to abandon the pleasures that are harmful. The same way with pains and the same way with truths. There are some truths that are harmful for your practice right now. For instance, you're trying to develop concentration. This is not the time to be thinking about the inconstancy and stressfulness of your concentration. You can apply perceptions of inconstancy and stressfulness to the distractions that pull you away, but for the concentration, you want to focus on this question. What can you make constant here? What sensations can you develop in the body that are constant even as the breath oughs in, the breath oughs out? How do you make them easeful, pleasant? How do you get this under your control? This is an area to which you don't apply the three perceptions. The same when you think about karma. There's a time when certain truths should be used, and other times when they shouldn't. There is a sutta where one of the young monks is asked by someone from another religion, "What does the Buddha say is the result of action?" And the young monk says, "The result of action is pain." Now, that wanderer had heard enough about the Buddha's teachings to realize that this didn't sound right, so he said, "That's not what I've heard from anybody else. You'd better check that with the Buddha." So the young monk goes back and checks with the Buddha, and the Buddha says, "You fool. You gave a categorical answer to a question that required an analytical answer." Then Udayan, who's a regular troublemaker in a lot of the suttas, says, "Well, Maybe he was thinking about the fact that actions give rise to feelings, and feelings are stressful. The Buddha said, this is not the context for that. When you talk about action, you're talking about skillful and unskillful, and you want to induce people to do skillful actions, so you point to the truth that skillful actions lead to relative pleasure. So there's a time and place for particular truths, and this is an important aspect of the teaching. We're not here to latch onto a truth, aside from holding it firmly enough as we're using it. You've got to see how it performs, because you can describe the world in all kinds of ways, but which description is going to be best at giving rise to dispassion? There's that sutta where a group of monks are going abroad to a part of India that wasn't in the middle country in India, and before they go, the Buddha tells them, first, take your leave of Sariputta. So they take leave of Sariputta, and he says, when intelligent people there ask you, what does your teacher teach? What are you going to say? The monks replied, we really would like to hear what you would have us say. So Sariputta says that the RST thing to say is, our teacher teaches the ending of passion. Notice, he doesn't mention the three characteristics, or emptiness, or compassion, or even the Four Noble Truths. He starts out with the ending of passion. Now, as another sutta says, dispassion is the highest Dhamma. It's what all the other teachings are meant to induce. Even when the Buddha gives the questionnaire on the three perceptions, is this constant or inconstant? Inconstant. If it's something inconstant, is it stressful or pleasant? Stressful. If it's inconstant and stressful, does it deserve to be self? No. Now, that's a value judgment. You're trying to develop dispassion through that questionnaire. That's what it's aimed at. It's supposed to perform. To do something to your sense of what's worth holding on to, and what's not. This is where you have to use your powers of judgment and evaluation. When you come across something in your meditation where you think, this is really true, you have to ask yourself, true for what purpose? And what does it do to your mind, keeping this particular truth in mind? If you see that it's having a bad effect, you tell yourself, that's not the truth. For right now. That's when you have to put aside that truth and any thoughts on that issue. Ultimately, all truths will have to be put aside, but you want to get the best use out of them, if they're useful, before letting them go. Treat them as tools, as means to an end, and then you'll be safe. Not self is a value judgment. October 16, 2015. When the Buddha taught breath meditation to his son Rahula, he prefaced his teachings with some contemplations that provided groundwork for breath meditation. One of the contemplations is not self, which may seem surprising because we usually think of the not self teaching as something designed for the last stages of the path. And it is true that when the Buddha taught people to let go of everything, to learn to identify nothing at all as self, he was speaking largely to people who were on the verge of becoming arahants, people who'd followed the path, all the activities of the path, and now were ready to let go of those activities and any sense of self that lingered around them, to reach a state of mind that was beyond activity. But even at the beginning of the path, it's useful to learn how to apply the reaction on not self in a more selective way. In brief, the Buddha's trying to get us to see our sense of self as an activity. We do identify with things and our sense of identity changes all the time. We pick up something and identify with it, and then we drop it to identify with something else. The dropping, which is an act of not self-ng, is also a type of activity. You want to learn how to see how it happens while it's happening. All too often we don't see it because we're so intent on moving on to the next sense of self and then the next. What happens in the process of letting go of something you used to identify with? That's something you want to look into and to take advantage of as you meditate. As you're sitting here, you could take on lots of different identities. The identity you want right now is the identity of a meditator. An earnest meditator. You're here really trying to get some genuine results from what you're doing. But there are a lot of other identities lurking in the background of the mind. The identity of you at work, the identity of you at home, the identity of you as a feeder, as an enjoyer of sensual pleasures. All kinds of identities that you could take on right now. For the time being at least, you have to learn how to not self those identities. See that they're not worth taking on. That's what the whole idea of self and not self is based on. It's not so much a metaphysical issue for most of us. It's a value judgment. And that's how the Buddha wants us to see it. As a value judgment. Is this particular self worth taking on? Or is it not? Is a particular identity something that's really worth following through? The same questions apply to the actions that you take on when you assume that identity. Are they worth it? This sort of calculation is something we're doing all the time, whether we're conscious of it or not. I was talking this morning with someone who was commenting on how the not-self teaching seemed very rare ed. I told him, look, you're not self-ng all the time. As you take on an identity, say, at work, you take on your work identity and drop the identity you take on at home. Even when you're at work, you can drop your work identity as you start thinking about other things that are not related to your work. Then, when you realize you've got to get work done, you take your work identity back on again, along with every issue of craving and clinging with which this sense of self is tied up. When the Buddha talks of the third noble truth, he says he wants you to see the mind as it lets go of craving, and to realize the good things that come about when you let go of that craving. But ordinarily, when we let go of one craving, we get so wound up into moving on to the next craving and then the next that we don't see the process of letting go. So as you meditate, and this is why this is a preliminary contemplation, you want to get good at that ability to realize that you've taken on an identity, and if it's not something you want, you cannot self it. You have better identities to choose from. If you end yourself suddenly wandering into the past by means of a little thought world, well, pull yourself out. This ability to pull out of an identity is a lot of what not self is about. Pulling out of those thought worlds. You see that the thought world, and your identity in the thought world, isn't worth it. And, of course, there'll be a voice in the mind that says, come on. Yes, it is. This is where you need a sense of values that enables you to decide whether you can trust that voice or not. Gaining a sense of values is one of the main points of the not-self teaching. What is your sense of values? What's important for you? Which identities do you want to develop? Which identities are worth developing? This is why the Buddha has us look at the arising of a sense of self, the passing away of a sense of self, the allure of a particular sense of self, and then the drawbacks of that sense of self, so that we can get beyond it. That's the same pattern of inquiry that he has us adopt for every activity, skillful and unskillful. There are times when you drop unskillful activities for the sake of skillful ones, and then you drop certain skillful activities because you want to move on to something even more skillful. When you gain a sense of awareness and duality around this, you learn how to do it more skillfully. If you end yourself stuck in a bad identity, you know there are ways of getting yourself out. So when the Buddha's teaching not self as a preliminary contemplation, it's like the RST step they teach you in Thai boxing. Before they teach you how to hit or kick, they teach you how to back away from your opponent without exposing yourself to his kicks. In other words, retreat is the RST thing you want to learn. And the same principle applies in meditation. You're going to be sitting here meditating, focused on the breath, and all of a sudden the breath seems far away, and you're in some other thought world. You want to be quick to recognize that, and quick to see the disadvantages of staying with that thought world. And then retreat from it. Let it go. There are other identities, of course, that you want to develop. Sitting here as a meditator, you want to be a good meditator. When you're at work, you want to be a good worker. If you're a part of a team, you want to be a good member of the team. In other words, realize that the identities you take on are choices you make. And you want to ask yourself, what choices will be for my long-term welfare and happiness? When you start thinking of self-ng and not self-ng as activities, you realize that they tie right in with the Buddha's teachings on karma. Basic wisdom around karma starts with the question, what, when I do it, will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? Well, insert the term self-ng and not self-ng in that question. What ways of self and not self will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? What ways of self and not self will lead to my long-term harm and suffering? That's the beginning of wisdom around the issues of self and not self. So learn to see the choice to self or to not self as it happens, as you take on or drop an identity, either as the potential consumer of some happiness, or as the person with the skills and abilities to bring that happiness about. See all that as a type of activity, as a type of karma. Then ask yourself, when is it skillful? When is it not? What types of self are skillful? When is it worth doing? When is it not? Again, not self is a value judgment. The Buddha's not asking you to draw conclusions about whether or not there is a self in the larger metaphysical sense. Even when he was talking to people on the verge of becoming arahants, giving them that questionnaire, notice how he phrased the questions. Form, feeling, perceptions, fabrications, consciousness. Are they constant or inconstant? They're inconstant. If they're inconstant, are they easeful or stressful? They're stressful. And the now question is not, then is there a self? No, the question is, are things that are inconstant and stressful worth holding on to as self or as being claimed as mere mine? The answer is no. It's a value judgment. So get your values straight as to which of your identities you want to take on, and which ones you don't. Learn to see your identity as something fluid, moving and changing its shape all the time like an amoeba. Sometimes looking like a horse, sometimes like a human being, sometimes like a diva, sometimes like a mouth with lots of fangs and teeth. Years back, when I was in Japan, I ran across a cartoon character called the Children's Police, a little tiny fat guy with an extremely malleable face. He seemed to be pure id. Whatever emotion was going through him would change the shape of his face. If he was angry, his nose would turn into a gun. If he was feeling lust, his nose got obscene. Inside, we're not all that tyrant. Our nose doesn't change shape that much as we go through the day, but if you could look at your sense of self, you'd end it changing shape all over the place, extending little pseudopods here or there. We tend to think of ourselves as just being us, which leaves us stuck with whatever us we end ourselves in. So it's good to see your sense of self as a fluid activity, and then ask yourself, how can I mold it in a way that's going to be helpful for long-term welfare and happiness? When you learn how to think in these terms, that's what eventually will get you to the point where you don't need a sense of self anymore. That's when you get to the ultimate level where you've found a happiness that doesn't need to do anything or require anything more to be done. At that point, self will have no more value, and you can put both it and not self aside. But in the meantime, learn a good sense of values around self and not self as they apply to the path. Because having that sense of values will really help you on your way. In alignment with the Buddha's teachings, we underscore the tremendous significance of sharing wisdom widely. At present, we've converted this extensive 1,000-page work into a user-friendly audio format. The responsibility to advance this noble endeavor now lies with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you play a pivotal role in the widespread distribution of these teachings, benefiting countless others. Let's continue the age-old tradition of knowledge dissemination and the nurturing of mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We wholeheartedly invite you to join us in this undertaking, and together, we can effect profound and positive changes in the lives of many.